A reading of Georgi Dimitrov's United Front, The Struggle Against Fascism and War, and Its Value for Our Moment, by Turner Roth from the New York Young Communist League and Communist Party USA. In a period of increasing tensions, where world powers, caught in the systemic compulsions of our contemporary capitalism dominated by the United States Axis, draw closer to forms of world historical conflict, a third world war being that thing which may, if it comes to pass, seal the fate of the human species on this planet, it becomes ever more relevant and pressing to read the ideas of those who came before us, who confronted these conditions of imperialism, war, and the political, social, economic degeneration into that which we call fascism. Georgi Dimitrov, 18th of June, 1882 to the 2nd of July, 1949, Bulgarian communist and leader of the Communist International from 1935 to 1943, later the leader of Bulgaria from 1946 to 1949, was one of those whose written and practical activity reflected in the highest degree a committed engagement with that which can be created to oppose the forms of large-scale destruction embodied in early to mid-century fascism. If today we are still living under those forms that threaten to engulf the entire world in flames, it is a reminder that we are needing ever more to comprehend what is happening around us and how best to go about changing it. To understand the conditions of the present, however, necessitates a living engagement with that which precedes us, whose lineaments form the historical conditions of what is in effect in the contemporaneity of our moment. As much as it feels to be the case that the time of the past ever faster recedes from where we are in the present, such that our contemporary problems seem to be all consumed within the very proximate conditions that form it, this epoch of the 1930s, within which Dimitrov wrote the majority of his most important writings, collected in the work we will be exploring here, his United Front, The Struggle Against Fascism and War, published in 1938, containing speeches and texts from the period of the Seventh World Congress of the Communist International in 1935. This epoch still holds great relevance for us to understand, as talk of a Third World War becomes increasingly heard. Dimitrov's writings in this period represent a deep theoretical and practical investigation and experimentation of those forms of struggle needed to prevent war, defeat fascism, and create a society built on the leadership of working people in which the horrors of war and domination have been transcended. While the conditions that Dimitrov was responding to and trying to intervene in were certainly different, there are undoubtedly many aspects of the struggle at this time and forms of organization that correspond to it that hold contemporary relevance. For what Dimitrov puts forward is not a set of dogmas extracted from a mix of experience and abstract logic, extended as universal, unchanging principles to guide all action at all times and places, but rather a mobile and historically open set of organizational problems that, while relevant wherever the fight for socialism and collective leadership occurs, do not prescribe any practical formulae that can simply be copied out from the book page to reality. Dimitrov poses open questions and problems of organization, revolving, as we shall see, around the ideas of unity and opposition. The dialectical movement of these terms create the historical material method of investigation and analysis that seeks to form the theoretical reflection and guide to action of the practical organizations that are the sole legitimizing and teleological fulfillment of what is postulated in theory. Dimitrov studied and applied the teachings of Marx and Lenin within the organizational structure of the international communist movement, defining what that means in practice within the period of the spread of fascism. The theoretical clarity and practical commitment of Georgi Dimitrov, the questions and problems he posed to his own time that even today, nearly 90 years later, still leap forth with the urgency of flesh and blood, are those that we will here try to draw out in a systematic way, showing the relations between the concepts and the reason why they were formed. We will be spending the majority of time looking at Dimitrov's main report delivered to the 7th Congress of the Comintern, the Fascist Offensive and the Tasks of the Communist International, but we'll consider as well alongside it his speech in reply to the discussion of his report, along with his speech delivered at the close of the Congress. We will also consider some speeches and texts from the years following 1935, principally his essays entitled The Struggle for Peace and the People's Front of 1936. It is the hope of this analysis that a sense of the overall movement and claims of these writings are made clear in their interrelations, so that a stronger theoretical grasp of the historical forms of relation to these themes is built up in order that we may be better able to approach the complexities of our moment. No simple reduction of the present to the past forms will suffice to clear the way for a proper theoretical and practical engagement today, but with an understanding of the past in hand, our understanding and thus possibility for action become enriched with the content of accumulated historical experience, on whose basis alone we can hope to advance soundly through all that remains unknown and unfinished. According to the 13th plenum of the Executive Committee of the Communist International, fascism is defined as, quote, the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of finance capital, unquote. As it was for Lenin, so for Dimitrov, fascism is that which comes about as a way of solving the crises brought about through imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. The ruling bourgeoisie come to seek salvation in it as a way of shifting the burden of increasing capitalist crisis and instability squarely onto the backs of the workers. Fascism thus is the outright dictatorship of finance capital, the logic of financial capital expressed in its highest form of negation of the working class. But fascism is not only the defeat of the working class, it is also the defeat of the liberal democratic bourgeois political order. It is the open terroristic vengeance against even the limited forms of democratic rights as they exist within capitalist societies, the thoroughgoing exclusion of all forms of independence and formal liberties. Fascism produces a qualitative, not simply quantitative, change in the existing political order. But fascism does not come onto the scene all at once. There is rather a quantitative buildup of reactionary measures put in place by the national bourgeoisie that, if not successfully countered, threaten to open up a qualitative rupture that brings onto the scene the open dictatorship of finance capital. Quote, before the establishment of a fascist dictatorship, bourgeois governments usually pass through a number of preliminary stages and adopt a number of reactionary measures which directly facilitate the accession to power of fascism. Whoever does not fight the reactionary measures of the bourgeoisie and the growth of fascism at these preparatory stages is not in a position to prevent the victory of fascism, but on the contrary, facilitates that victory, unquote. Social democratic leaders, adherents of the Second International, and those who led or were in coalition governments in the various European countries that most proximately were affected by the rise of fascism at this time, betrayed the people according to Dimitrov, helping create the conditions for destruction of the working class in those areas in moments when the fascist threat was not properly seen for what it was. Those who are not able to mobilize united resistance to the quantitative heightening of fascist forces will not be able to prevent the qualitative change of bourgeois democracy into that of fascism. In this sense, these misleaders of the workers bear the historical responsibility for this failure. But how does fascism take hold of the people? In relation to an ineffective fight back against it, fascism was effective in taking on the garb of the revolutionary working class movements, concealing its alliance to the most oppressive capitalist actors through playing on the desperation of the masses and the genuine impulse for revolutionary change. Quote, fascism aims at the most unbridled exploitation of the masses, but it approaches them with the most artful anti-capitalist demagogy, taking advance of the deep hatred of the working people against the plundering bourgeoisie, the banks, trusts, and financial magnates, and advancing those slogans which, at the given moment, are most alluring to the politically immature masses. Unquote. And so, dressed in the garb of anti-capitalism, fascism institutes an even deeper system of exploitation than that practiced under bourgeois liberal democracies. A new state bureaucracy is formed that functions to an even greater degree as the facilitator of surplus value extraction. Monopoly capital is expanded through the outright dictatorial control the state wields over the workers, who have lost even the right to organize, strike, and circulate information. Fascism claims that it will liberate the countryside from the tyranny of the landowners and the banks, but instead only further plunges agricultural workers into domination and servitude. So how was fascism able to come to power? Dimitrov responds that it is because of the class collaborationism of the Social Democrats and the weakness of the Communist parties to lead a decisive struggle against fascism that fascism was able to accede to power, despite being contrary to the interests of the majority of the people. If the German and Austrian masses had followed the road of the Russian Bolsheviks and not those of the collaborationist Social Democrats, quote, not the bourgeoisie, but the working class would long ago have been the master of the situation in Europe, unquote. Instead of taking this road, the Social Democrats instead granted concessions to the most reactionary forces of the bourgeoisie and split the masses through refusing to form united action with the communist parties and the revolutionary workers. The Social Democratic leaders refused to bring the force of the state against the rising fascist movement, instead using the state apparatus to repress and hogtie the communists. Instead of going against the banks that were ruining the peasants, they collaborated with them, which was a central condition of fascism's spread in the countryside. In Spain, the same story of class collaboration applies, wherein the socialists failed to unite forces, failed to go after the banks, the landlords, failed to purge the armed forces of fascist elements, and failed to fortify the electoral system to prevent the fascists from taking it over. Fascism also was able to take in a large section of the youth through its harnessing of their resentment toward the continued immiseration of living standards overseen by social democratic administrations, as well as offering youth a promise of a better future through militant activity, which the Social Democrats had completely abandoned. While these conditions apply, Dimitrov does not eschew looking inward as well, pointing to a number of errors committed by the communist parties, which to an extent also bear responsibility for the rise of fascism. A persistent underemphasis of the fascist threat by communists led to a lack of conviction that it presented one of the greatest dangers to the working classes of the world, and hence a lack of organizational defense and sufficient mobilization needed to counter it. Many communists believed that in a country like Germany, with long-standing worker movements and a well-established bourgeois democracy, fascism would not be able to take hold. Despite these errors of both the communists and the Social Democrats, Dimitrov emphasizes that preventing fascism was still possible at the time of his writing, and gives a number of conditions needed to be fulfilled in order for that to happen. The working class would need to unite its forces on a much larger scale in order to neutralize those sections of the working class and petty bourgeoisie that fell under its influence. There would need to be strong revolutionary parties that broke definitively with class collaboration and led the masses. There would need to be a policy of struggle suited to where the uneducated and backward masses stand, leading them steadfastly to see that fascism is a direct threat to them. Finally, there must be a spirit of fight and determination to not cede an inch to fascism and to strike it wherever it appears. Yet while fascism had already taken hold of a large swaths of the population of Europe and Asia, Dimitrov emphasizes that its hold on power is fundamentally unstable because the forms of resolution to contradictions it attempts to enforce only accentuate class conflict. Quote, the existence of the capitalist system, the existence of various classes, and the accentuation of class contradictions inevitably tend to undermine and explode the political monopoly of fascism. Unquote. Another reason for instability is related to this, in that despite its proclamations of anti-capitalism crafted to lure in the discontented masses, fascism serves only to aggravate those class contradictions, deepening the divide between the propertyless masses and the integrated monopoly capitalists and fascist state bureaucrats. It also appropriates a large portion of the national resources for war, which only intensifies inter-capitalist rivalries and leads to instability. But despite these instabilities, quote, fascism will not collapse automatically. It is only the revolutionary activity of the working class which can help to take advantage of the conflicts which inevitably arise within the bourgeois camp in order to undermine the fascist dictatorship and to overthrow it. Yet such seizing of initiative to undermine fascism is difficult, if not impossible, so long as class collaboration persists, which is precisely what the Social Democrats in Germany represented, who bear the majority of historical culpability for the rise and taking over of fascism and the refusal to form a united front with communists. The single most important aspect of the fight against fascism for Dimitrov is unity of action of the workers. This is what the United Front means, unity of action of the national and international working classes. Such a united front, in order to be truly international in character, must reject the policy of social imperialism of the class collaborationists, so as to form bonds of unity with the superexploited workers of the colonies and imperialized nations. So long as such a split between the workers of the imperialist nations and imperialized nations remains, the unity needed to defeat fascism internationally will be weakened. Important to note as well that such unity of action must be achieved even before the majority of workers commit themselves to the overthrowing of capitalism and creation of a worker state. Anti-fascist unity of action will necessarily contain a certain ideological heterogeneity insofar as the workers, both in Dimitrov's time but also in our own, are not yet unified around the idea of proletarian revolution. To pose as a requirement of entry into the United Front such a commitment to revolutionary socialism would only split the total forces necessary to defeat fascism. The goal is rather for the communist workers to lead such a united front and to demonstrate by their courage of conviction and soundness of action that they are the ones best suited to lead and that their ideas go the furthest in establishing working class power. Quote, we must not confine ourselves to bare appeals to struggle for the proletarian dictatorship. We must also find and advance those slogans and forms of struggle which arise from the vital needs of the masses, from the level of their fighting capacity at the present stage of development. Unquote. The most important points to hit upon are convincing the workers that the crises leading to the rise of fascism have to do with the contradictions caused by the owners of capital. Further, there must be prepared the ground to fight back against the stripping of liberties such as they exist within bourgeois democratic states and against the movement toward imperialist war. The leaders of the United Front must be able to prepare the workers for sudden shifts in tactics in accordance with the enemy's development and to prepare the ground for mass strike action. The communists must continue their independent forms of activity, but must not shirk organization with reformist and non-communist institutions. Within the United Front, special consideration must be given to the masses of unorganized workers who constitute the majority of workers within most countries. The organized workers must make it their business to form bonds with these workers on the basis of unified anti-fascist action. In the countries where fascism had taken hold, Dimitrov called on the anti-fascist United Front forces to work within the various fascist mass organizations to overturn them. He notes that at this time, there had not been successful examples of mass organized opposition to fascist dictatorship, Italy having still not achieved a mass anti-fascist basis, even after 13 years of struggle. The heroic resistance to fascism does not equal the successful mobilization of a mass anti-fascist basis. And in this way, quote, in our struggle against fascist dictatorship, it is particularly dangerous to confuse the wish with the fact. We must base ourselves on the facts, on the actual concrete situation. The main issue in the German situation at this time is that the workers, conscious of the possibility and necessity of a struggle against fascism so as to overturn it, are in the minority, while the larger masses of workers mainly stand idle. While fascism claims to represent all classes and strata of society, it is in fact the dictatorship of large capital, and as such will come into conflict with the masses it claims to equally represent. In order to win over the masses, the class-conscious workers, the advanced section of the working class, must work within the mass fascist institutions as the defenders of the economic, political, and cultural life of the individual subjected to the fascist dictatorship. Only in this way, Dimitrov claims, can the masses who have been coerced into the various forms of fascist society see how those conditions do not represent their best interest. The class-conscious workers will thereby expand a mass basis of anti-fascist resistance. Even the discontented supporters of fascism, if the right tactics are employed, can be brought to join the ranks of anti-fascist opposition. But this is only possible if the class-conscious workers work within fascist institutions and prove themselves the true upholders of the political and economic rights of the citizen. It is not true, Dimitrov claims, that the possibility to form means of resistance are made impossible under fascist dictatorships. It is precisely this conception that impedes the will to form such means of resistance, thereby ensuring all the more the triumph of fascism. In order to seize this initiative, the class-conscious workers need to be where the masses are, so must work within the fascist mass organizations. Communists must, quote, rid themselves once and for all of the prejudice that such activity is unseemly and unworthy of a revolutionary worker, unquote. Dimitrov thus sees revolutionaries working within the mass fascist organizations as those best poised to bring down the fortress of fascism through a Trojan horse-like internal destruction of the enemy. But in countries where social democratic governments were still in power or in a coalition holding power, the absolute opposition that communists have to the policies of such governments should not impede the attempts to form a united front with such class collaborationists and bourgeois elements. Such an attempt is indeed necessary. Communists have a duty to join their organizations with social democratic ones wherever the possibility presents itself. Such joining, though it is resisted by the social democratic leaders, will have the effect of radicalizing the overall workers' movement, a large part of which is non-revolutionary. Many communists in this period, however, had a tendency to dogmatically reject the partial measures of the Social Democrats instead of building unity around certain partial demands so as to push them further in a radical direction. A general methodological point regarding communists joining forces with bourgeois reformist organizations is put by Dimitrov as follows. Quote, joint action with the social democratic parties and organizations requires from communists serious and substantiated criticism of social democracy as the ideology and practice of class collaboration with the bourgeoisie, an untiring comradely explanation for the social democratic workers of the program and slogans of communism. In countries having social democratic governments, this task is of particular importance in the struggle for the united front, unquote. In the unions, the same principles as those put forth for working with the social democratic institutions must be applied. Class collaboration, of course, had resulted in many of the main unions at this time being very fractious entities where communists were targeted and removed. Yet Dimitrov insists that despite these measures, communists must work within such unions to fight for anti-fascist unity within them. Where dual unions had been formed, such unions should seek to amalgamate with the larger trade union movement on the basis of anti-fascist unity of action. Communists, in particular, must belong to the trade union movement. They must make it their obligation to transform the reformist mass trade unions from within to the position of anti-fascist industrial unionism. In addition, special consideration must be given to the question of youth organization within the United Front. The YCLs of the world displayed heroism in the fight against fascism, but heroism is not enough. There needs to be a scientific approach to the struggle, which means engaging certain tasks of basic organizing in order to transform youth organizations into a mass anti-fascist movement. Quote, "For the problem of the youth is not only a young communist league problem, it is a problem for the whole communist movement. In the struggle for the youth, the communist parties and the YCL organizations must actually effect a decisive change. The main task of the communist youth movement in capitalist countries is to advance boldly in the direction of bringing about the United Front, along the path of organizing and uniting the young generation of working people." Unquote. In essence, Dimitrov is saying that the Young Communist League should not be a sectarian organization or distinct in any fundamental respects from the larger youth organizations. It should be a leader in the united front of the youth of all those who oppose fascism. Dimitrov speaks as well of the potential need of forming a united front government before revolution has occurred. He affirms that communists must take part in such a government on the condition that it does not erode party structure and organizational capacity. Such a coalitional government would be one of united anti-fascist struggle. Quote, "It is primarily a government of struggle against fascism and reaction. It must be a government arising as the result of the United Front movement and in no way restricting the activity of the Communist Party and the mass organizations of the working class, but on the contrary, taking resolute measures against the counter-revolutionary financial magnates and their fascist agents." Unquote. Such a government would arise in times of crisis when the ruling classes are no longer able to contain the mass anti-fascist movement. Disorganization and paralysis of the existing structure are necessary preconditions. Further, there needs to be mass mobilization of the trade unions against fascism and an openness of the non-communist elements to work with the communists. Both the right opportunists and the ultra-leftists had misunderstood this need, the first believing that parliamentary arrangements were sufficient in themselves, and the second refusing to enter into any united front arrangements with social democratic parties. The formation of such a united front government, Dimitrov stresses, is not the end goal. It is not a substitute for revolution, but is an intermediate stage in the movement toward a revolutionary overthrow of the prevailing class order. One of the most important struggles the United Front faces with respect to fascism is the ideological struggle, which Dimitrov chides communists for not responding to sooner and in more forceful a fashion. The reason for the slowness he states as being due to the disbelief that such a stupid and putrid ideology could actually gain widespread traction among the masses. He stresses how one must in all respects counter the nationalism that the fascists take up and amplify through mythological revisioning of history, but that we should not in so doing trample upon the pride and certain patriotic sentiments of the workers, reducing them to nothing. We must, on the contrary, give the actual history of the toiling masses through clarifying the decisive roles that working people have played in shaping their own history. Quote, "We communists are the irreconcilable opponents on principle of bourgeois nationalism in all its forms. But we are not supporters of national nihilism and should never act as such. The task of educating the workers and all working people in the spirit of proletarian internationalism is one of the fundamental tasks of every communist party. but anyone who thinks that this permits him, or even compels him, to sneer at all the national sentiments of the wide masses of working people is far from being a genuine Bolshevik and has understood nothing of the teaching of Lenin and Stalin on the national question." Unquote. Proletarian internationalism is the foundation of the saving of all that is good in the nation, that is, the collectivity and history of the workers of the country in their struggle for creating a better world. The communists of oppressing nations have a special responsibility of educating the people regarding proletarian internationalism, emphasizing how the supposed freedom of their nation cannot be as such so long as other nations' peoples are being oppressed. In sum, communists must equally avoid bourgeois nationalism and national nihilism. This is all to say that in the formation of a united front against fascism, communist parties must play a leading role. There can be no anti-fascist direction if the revolutionary section of the movement is sidelined. But to play such a leading role, communist parties must strengthen themselves internally. Strengthening the party and bringing in new members is pursued not solely for the narrow aim of bolstering the party, but because this bolstering is necessary for strengthening the united front forces. One major impediment that Dimitrov highlights is that of sectarianism within the ranks of the parties. Sectarianism is here identified with narrow dogmatic approaches that do not have their bases in the actual experience of struggle, but in self-selecting theories divorced from the masses. To appraise on the basis of our wishes of where the revolutionary potential of the masses stands leads to a situation in which communists overestimate the actual possibilities of the masses, believing that difficult intermediary stages of development of revolutionary potential can simply be skipped over. This leads to communists leading their own narrow group and not the masses. Quote, "Sectarianism finds expression particularly in overestimating the revolutionization of the masses and overestimating the speed at which they are abandoning the positions of reformism and in attempting to leap over difficult stages and the complicated tasks of the movement. In practice, methods of leading the masses have frequently been replaced by the methods of leading a narrow party group." Unquote. The question of the unity and efficiency of the communist parties in their leading role in a united front against fascism brings into relief the question of the political unity of the forces, which can provoke the demand that the communist parties and social democratic parties join ranks to form a unitary political leadership at the party level. Dimitrov finishes his report with an analysis of the conditions of this unitary formation. The increasing amalgamation of the forces of labor within the unions was bringing into debate the question of the amalgamation of political structures. The conditions of political amalgamation rest on principles that Dimitrov elaborates as follows. Firstly, the complete independence from the bourgeoisie and rupture of the social democrats with the bourgeois bloc. That unity of action prevails. That revolutionary overthrow of the bourgeoisie through a dictatorship of the proletariat be recognized. That support for the imperialist wars of the bourgeoisie be completely rejected. And finally, that the resulting amalgamated party be based on the organizational principle of democratic centralism. Dimitrov explains the reason for the first condition, that total independence from the bourgeoisie be sought as follows. Quote, "The whole experience of the labor movement, particularly the experience of the 15 years of coalition policy in Germany, has shown that the policy of class collaboration, the policy of dependence on the bourgeoisie, leads to the defeat of the working class and to the victory of fascism. And only the road of irreconcilable class struggle against the bourgeoisie, the road of the Bolsheviks, is the true road to victory." Unquote. In terms of unity of action, he states that, quote, "To propose to unite at once with the Social Democrats instead of forming a united front means to place the cart before the horse and to imagine that the cart will then move ahead." Unquote. Unity of anti-fascist action must be guaranteed beforehand, on the basis of which unity of political ideas can then be constructed. And as to the third condition, the recognition of the necessity of a dictatorship of the proletariat, Dimitrov states that, quote, "The bourgeoisie would rather drown the labor movement in a sea of blood than allow the proletariat to establish socialism by peaceful means, unquote. The condition of total opposition to imperialist war is also a condition of amalgamation, and that, quote, all imperialists combine their feverish preparations for war with extremely intensified exploitation and oppression of the working people in their own country, unquote. Opposition to such preparations and deployments of force is thus a non-negotiable point of unity for whatever amalgamation of political parties might be brought about. Finally, the condition of democratic centralism as the guiding principle of action must be guaranteed because, quite simply, only through it can the victory of the working masses be brought into existence. Victory is inseparable from thoroughgoing, expansive democratic investment of the party structure, together with the discipline of a unity of action to bring into existence what is decided and the democratic realm of the multiplicity of perspectives and ideas that define the collective. The struggle to advance the United Front line through developing forms of relation to the Social Democrats and reactionary trade unions necessarily led to critiques from certain communists that a shift rightward is at play here in the Communist International movement at this time, where the transition to unity of action against fascism has superseded the position of opposition to social fascism, that is, the policy that had been in practice hitherto that practiced opposition on principle with the Social Democrats. Dimitrov chides the communists who put forward this critique as follows, quote, we want our parties in the capitalist countries to come out and act as real political parties of the working class, to become an actual fact, a political factor in the life of their countries, to pursue at all times an active Bolshevik mass policy and not confine themselves to propaganda and criticism, and bare appeals to struggle for proletarian dictatorship, unquote. He continues this thought with the statement that, quote, we are enemies of all cut and dried schemes. We want to take into account the concrete situation at each moment and each place, and not act according to a fixed stereotyped form anywhere and everywhere. Not to forget that in varying circumstances, the position of the communists cannot be identical, unquote. The United Front policy is thus put forward to overcome the isolation of the revolutionary vanguard with respect to the masses, to not be fixed within certain schemes that are non-flexible and tend toward a turning inward of revolutionary sentiment, a fixation on ideas over that of the multifaceted application of ideas. It is thus a question of genuine revolutionary realism, which is to, quote, put an end to the last remnants of scholastic tinkering with serious political questions, unquote. The International United Front of Anti-Fascist Forces thus brings to bear the struggle of living socialism against dead doctrinarism. Only living socialism can, quote, sail on the turbulent waters of the class struggle. Let us now take up here what is meant by the People's Front. Quite simply, the People's Front is an extension of the United Front concept to include those sections of the population not belonging to the wage-earning workers exploited directly by the capitalists. The lower sections of the petty bourgeoisie, the middle class between the workers and the owners, were to be drawn as far as it was possible into a front opposed to fascism and war. Religious and educational institutions as well were sought as allies in an alliance with the United Front of Anti-Fascist Workers, as were other civil and cultural institutions not controlled by the workers themselves. The People's Front thus envisions the furthest possible unity of action that embraces as wide a diversity of the population as is willing to work together to halt the most vicious forms of capitalism and decay. In his December 1936 essay on the topic, Dimitrov notes how all the reactionary elements of the bourgeoisie, the misleaders of workers, and the fascists together feared and railed at this time against the People's Front, which had grown and become one of the greatest impediments to the spread of fascism. Quote, the Pope at Rome and their graces, the bishops in different countries, hastened with epistles and sermons to shield their flock from that frightful Bolshevik danger, the People's Front. The question of the People's Front is always in the columns of the press in the capitalist countries and is the subject of the most lively discussion, unquote. The People's Front is here what constitutes the greatest setback to the causes of war and fascism, for it is what unites the disunited workers and other social groupings within capitalist and fascist societies. It is the greatest force in moving away from the path that fascism opens up, a possibility latent within the form of capitalist society. The People's Front program creates what Dimitrov calls an insurmountable barrier to the further advance of fascism. Such a barrier would be not only a check on fascism, but in the process of assembling a vast collectivity between classes with the workers at the head, the way is opened up for an advance toward the final revolutionary goal, the victory of labor over capital. The left critics of the People's Front, however, assume that such a uniting of the working class with the other democratic-minded sections of the population represents a retreat from the class struggle, an instantiation of the class collaboration that helped serve the rise of fascism. But for Dimitrov, quote, they make the mistake of identifying the policy of the People's Front with the policy of class collaboration with the bourgeoisie, and demand a pure working class policy, declaring that the joint struggle of the working class and the democratic sections of the lower middle classes, the peasantry and intelligentsia, against fascism constitutes a retreat from the position of the class struggle, unquote. Dimitrov will show how this is not at all the case, how the People's Front policy, if fully enacted, is the only way to defeat the fascist danger, and in so doing lay the conditions for the formation of full worker control over society and the economy. He repeats again the idea that the People's Front cannot be copied according to formulae and implanted without variation from one country to the next. Each country has its specificity that will determine the form that the People's Front will take. That which does remain the same, however, are those principles that determine class basis and direction of the movement, which has to do with the consolidation of united front forces leading the Popular Front, which will unequivocally fight for peace and development within the specificity of the struggle against fascism. At this time, the fight for peace and struggle against fascism necessitated the taking up of arms against the fascist threat. This taking up of arms, Dimitrov stresses, is not done because the people want war, but because the people oppose it. There can thus be no retreat and no passive attitude with regard to the advances of fascism. Quote, the policy of retreating before fascism, both nationally and on the international scale, brings grist to the mill of fascism. It brings destruction to the nations. It means the end of democracy. This policy is equally harmful for those who retreat before fascism inside the country and those states which retreat before it on the international arena, unquote. From this attitude of retreat and appeasement comes the correlated idea that building up the People's Front will only further provoke the fascist danger, concluding from this that the best course of action is to not confront the fascists head-on, for fear that it will lead to even worse consequences. Dimitrov resolutely dismisses this position as that of the timid, unwitting accomplice to the further advances of fascism, which was precisely what many of the misleaders of the workers were putting forward. This is the position that the German and Austrian social democratic misleaders adopted, refusing to enter into alliance with the communists, with the terrible, predictable results of that decision. In order to win over the workers and successfully challenge the feeble-minded class collaborationist misleaders who helped pave the way for fascism, Dimitrov calls for an all-out push for unification, attending to all the forms of impediment wherever they occur in a way that overcomes the resistance to forming as great an alliance as possible against the fascist forces. Quote, we must know how to carry on an unabated ideological struggle against the reformism and other anti-Marxist tendencies in the ranks of the working class movement, and at the same time fight persistently for the establishment of the United People's Front, and carefully avoid any disruption of united action in the daily struggle against fascism and war, unquote. Dimitrov's report to the Seventh Congress of the Communist International received unanimous support from all the delegates present. Dimitrov, of course, celebrates this fact, but in his reply to the Comintern's delegates' discussion of his report, he seeks a deepening of the theoretical and practical issues which the report brought to bear. Unanimity is a good thing, he states, but that doesn't mean it is sufficient to truly solving the issues of the day. Certain unanimous decisions were made in previous Congresses, he reminds, but, quote, our decisions did not become flesh and blood for the wide masses. They did not become a guide to the action of millions of people, unquote. The main idea here is to reflect on how the principles of the United Front and the fight against fascism receive their largest possible uptake, not just by communists, but by the masses. First of all, there cannot be a general fight against fascism without concrete analyses of how fascism has developed within the various nations it has taken root. To treat fascism as a generalizable phenomenon that acts uniformly throughout all its manifestations is to hamstring from the outset an effective fight back against it. Fascism acts according to certain principles and motivations that do have interconnections, but the particular circumstances of its development as a social and political structure will invariably be different in each context. Fascism had, of course, by this time developed most fully in Germany, but Dimitrov warns against underestimating the fascist threat in places like France and in places where fascism did not have a strong mass base, as in Finland, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. He highlights how the possibility of a fascist coup d'etat could bring fascism even to those places where there is not an organic mass base for it. He also highlights the erroneousness of calling all reactionary measures of the bourgeoisie fascist and lumping all non-communists together as equally fascist. This leads to a misrecognition of the particularity of fascism and thereby weakens resistance to it. Quote, there was a tendency among us to contemplate fascism in general without taking into account the specific features of the fascist movement in the various countries, erroneously classifying all reactionary measures of the bourgeoisie as fascism and going as far as calling the entire non-communist camp fascist. The struggle against fascism was not strengthened, but rather weakened in consequence, unquote. He here mounts an invective against a certain laziness of analysis, a jumbling together of phenomena under abstract formula applied to concretely different situations. Quote, unable to approach the phenomena of real life concretely, some comrades who suffer from mental laziness substitute general non-committal formula for a careful and concrete study of the actual situations of the relationship of class forces, unquote. In this reply to the discussion of the report, there is raised the crucial question of the dialectical relation of the United and People's Front. Dimitrov analyzes the question posed of what needs to be established first, a united front of the proletariat or a People's Front against fascism. His response is that both need to be established simultaneously and in dialectical relation with one another. The united forces of the proletariat need to be established as the guiding force of a People's Front against fascism, while the People's Front needs to be developed as the main bloc against the fascist offensive and as simultaneously the support to strengthening the united proletarian front. The transformation of the United Front into a People's Front against fascism is not possible without the further development of working class unity, which does not mean simply taking the reformist mass organization as they are, but in transforming these mass organizations to the perspective of class struggle. However, to conceive of a certain chain of causality leading from one moment necessarily to the next that can be applied indiscriminately is the mark of idealism and sectarianism. In various countries, the dialectic between the development of the United Front of the proletariat and the People's Front will proceed differently. Poland, for example, had a strong peasant movement, which was being radicalized by the agrarian crisis there. In such a situation, Dimitrov argues the United and People's Front will advance much more in step with each other. The question is then asked whether the social democratic parties and the labor aristocracy that forms the greatest supports are, at this point in time, the chief bulwarks of the bourgeoisie. Dimitrov answers that they increasingly are not, for the rise of fascism has shown that class collaborationist policies had failed to stem the tide of fascism, and that finance capital was increasingly taking up the banner of fascism to overcome crisis. Dimitrov thus puts forward the view of social democracy in a transitional moment, one where many of the workers in its camp can be brought to the side of the communists and the principles of class struggle. This transition, however, will not be immediate, and so the tactics of the communists must adapt themselves to the reality of intermediate forms of struggle and attaining unity. Communists will need to be able to explain their program and principles and convince the social democratic workers on the basis of their own experience, not on that of abstract principles. Quote, the work of explaining the principles and program of communism must be carried on patiently in a comradely fashion and must be adapted to the degree of development of the individual social democratic workers. Our criticism of social democracy must become more concrete and systematic and must be based on the experience of the social democratic masses themselves. Unquote. Dimitrov then addresses the question of what the communist attitude toward bourgeois democracy should be. To this very important and contested question, one which we are today still very divided in our response, Dimitrov resolutely, unequivocally condemns the attitude that there is no difference between a bourgeois dictatorship with formal democratic rights and a fascist dictatorship without those rights. Quote, we are not anarchists, and it is not at all a matter of indifference to us what kind of political regime exists in any given country, whether a bourgeois dictatorship in the form of bourgeois democracy, even with democratic rights and liberties greatly curtailed, or a bourgeois dictatorship in its open fascist form. While being upholders of Soviet democracy, we shall defend every inch of the democratic gains which the working class has wrested in the course of years of stubborn struggle, and shall resolutely fight to extend these gains. Unquote. Now, this of course does not mean that upholding bourgeois democracy is a universal principle. At the time of the Russian Revolution and immediately afterwards, the Soviets were engaged in a struggle against the upholders of bourgeois democracy, which were the assembled anti-revolutionary parties that sought to defeat the revolutionary gains the Soviets had made. But within the context of the 1930s capitalist countries where fascism was making advances, upholding bourgeois formal rights absolutely was a necessary counteroffensive against the liquidating forces of fascism. Dimitrov remarks how it was a fundamental error for the German communists to have continued into the 1930s the anti-bourgeois democratic rhetoric and tactics that marked the period of struggle against the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. The German communists failed to see how the terrain had shifted and how the threat of fascism had become the overriding life or death issue of greatest import to confront. In essence, communists err wherever they situate on the same plane the reactionary measures of bourgeois democracies and those ultra-reactionary measures of the fascists. The latter, whether it is in its beginning or advanced phases, should be the ultimate target on the basis of which a united front of workers and an all-people's front against fascism is to be constructed. In order to lead the masses, however, a correct line is not enough. In addition, there is needed organizational guarantees that decisions made will be carried through in practice. There's also needed the ability to convert the decisions of the Communist International into decisions made by the workers themselves. A study of the history of Bolshevism shows that, quote, the Bolsheviks never substituted methods of leading the party for methods of leading the masses, unquote. Part of successful leading of the masses has to do with the translation of difficult theoretical language into terms which the masses can readily understand and put into practice. It is in fact in this inability to translate their ideas into everyday language that the fascists outdo the communists, in certain cases. Quote, the fascists have often proven more dexterous and flexible than many of our comrades, unquote. Dimitrov then unveils what he calls an elementary rule of all communist language. Quote, when writing or speaking, always have in mind the rank and file worker who must understand you, must believe in your appeal and be ready to follow you. You must have in mind those for whom you write, to whom you speak, unquote. Dimitrov finishes this response to the discussion of his address to the 7th Congress of the Comintern with a look at cadre development, a matter of extreme importance, but about which he deplores the lack of discussion at the Congress. Quote, "In their practical work, our parties have not yet realized by far that people, cadres, decide everything," unquote. The issue at this time is that the most experienced cadres are at the greatest risk of death or imprisonment, so for this reason the question of replenishing and training new leading cadres is of vital importance. A correct policy with regard to cadres involves the identification of one's people, who is and who is not acting for the interests of the party in accordance with democratic centralism. It also involves the proper promotion of cadres to leadership. Dimitrov stresses that this should not be done in a haphazard way, according to metrics that do not accord with the fundamental aim of the party, which is that of establishing direct lines with the masses so that the party becomes the party of the masses. Also, correct policy with regard to cadre development has to do with the ability to use people to the best advantage, matching their skills and abilities to those functions best able to utilize them. There also needs to be the proper distribution of cadres, making sure that those leaders who have sprung from the masses and have the closest link with them are distributed across the widest area within which a given communist party is operative. The systematic assistance of cadres is also needed, making sure that each stage of their development is seen to and guided in the best way possible, maximizing strengths and minimizing defects. Finally, Dimitrov speaks of the proper preservation of cadres, attending to those conditions within which the parties are operating that best is able to envisage the path forward and guide the party safely through trying circumstances. He also stresses the need to develop strong party and YCL schools that are able to elucidate scientific socialism, not just in general, but in its various forms of practical application. The schools wherein cadres are trained would provide the conditions for instilling a resistance to hackneyed formulas, pedantry, and doctrinarism. Quote, "Their imitation, simply copying of methods and forms of work, even of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, in countries where capitalism is still supreme, may with the best of intentions result in harm rather than good, as has so often actually been the case. It is precisely from the experience of the Russian Bolsheviks that we must learn to apply effectually to the specific conditions of life in each country the single international line. In the struggle against capitalism, we must learn pitilessly to cast aside, pillory, and hold up to general ridicule all phrase-mongering, use of hackneyed formulas, pedantry, and doctrinarism," unquote. Dimitrov ends his response with this sentence, quote, "There is but one thing that the working class of the capitalist countries still lacks: unity in its own ranks." In an essay from 1936, Dimitrov points out how the threat of fascism is not simply a threat to the Soviet Union, not simply a threat directed toward communism, but a threat in the first interest to all those people geographically proximate to the fascist German forces. The working people of France, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Poland. In the East, the first targets of Japanese fascism were the peoples of China, Philippines, and Australia. Fascism threatened all and is approaching the whole of the world because it was not defeated in its preparatory phases. Quote, "The war danger has become so immediately threatening because the road to power was not barred against German fascism at the proper moment. Having obtained power by means of an internal war against the mass of the people of its own country, fascism has grown a direct war menace to the countries of the whole world. Having enslaved its own people, it is advancing with the torch of war in its hand to attack other peoples," unquote. Fascism was not held in check because the capitalist powers, whether in the United States or Britain, did not mount the response adequate to keeping the war danger contained, letting or even assisting Germany to arm itself and letting Japan and Italy invade other nations without opposition. Though of course the imperialist bourgeoisie of the capitalist democracies deserve much of the blame for the rise of fascism, given that fascism is itself an internal development of the capitalist order in crisis, Dimitrov seeks to place much of the responsibility on the misleaders of labor and of those political parties and groupings that did not come together on the basis of an anti-fascist united front. The reactionary leadership of labor and social democratic governments and parties refused in many cases to join the international communist movement, and in particular the Soviet Union, to rout out the upsurge of fascist activity and hold fascist Germany, Japan, and Italy in check. But there are also those on the left, including within the ranks of the communist movement, who did not take the danger seriously and preached a fatalism concerning the inevitability of war. Quote, "Since the fundamental cause of war is capitalism, Then, they say, so long as the latter exists, it is impossible to avoid war, and it is hopeless and useless to fight for the maintenance of peace. Such people are out-and-out doctrinaires, if not simply impostors. They see everywhere around them the raging forces of war, but they do not at all notice the mighty factors for peace." Unquote. This religion of doom fails to see how the majority of the working people within the capitalist countries do not want war, and on the basis of this collective will can be equipped with the resources to avoid it. Within a strong organization of the anti-war, anti-fascist United Front, an organized direction can be given to the overwhelming collective opposition to the devastation of war. It is the possibility and necessity of this unity that both the left doomers and the misleaders of working people fundamentally fail to see, paving the way for the advances of fascism and war. Dimitrov counters these attitudes and positions with the assertion that, quote, "if these masses, without whom war could not be carried on, were to act resolutely and promptly against the war plans of the governments, they could force these governments to renounce war and the abetting of war plotters." The whole thing is to organize the struggle of the peoples for the maintenance of peace and good time, and to carry it on continually and everywhere against the fascist warmongers and their backers. Unquote. The hands of the warmongers need to be tied by as large an organized presence as possible in all nations on the basis of an opposition to war and fascism. Only a people's front led by the proletariat would have the capacity to effectively bring about this state of affairs. Dimitrov highlights how it is inadequate for such a collectivity to agitate against war in general, to have things remain at an abstract level. Such a general propaganda is not adequate to the task of preventing the actuality of war. He states rather that it is essential to, quote, "work out a definite and correct tactical line in the struggle for the maintenance of peace, taking into account the situation of the party and the working class movement of the given country, and also its internal and international situation." Unquote. Part of this tactical line in the countries under threat from fascism involves the working out of the relation between the workers and the foreign policies of their governments. It should not by any means become a matter of indifference what foreign policy the bourgeois governments under threat from the fascist powers adopt with respect to the fascists. The bourgeoisie, of course, requisitions all say to the foreign policy of the government as a matter of course, but such monopoly over decision-making needs to be frontally challenged by the United Front. It is up to such a united front as well to fight for the greatest possible democratization of the national bourgeois systems, pushing it in the direction of greater democratic control within the limits of capitalism, rather than letting it fall prey to the fundamentally illiberal, anti-democratic seizure by the most reactionary elements of capital. The content and way by which these things are brought about will again vary from country to country, depending on the balance of forces and form of relation to the fascist threat. But the fundamental principle of unity of the working class and extension to a people's front against fascism remains the same. Dimitrov calls for pushing the League of Nations to take a more active and oppositional approach with respect to the fascist aggressors. Rather than heed the doctrinaire leftist call to oppose the League of Nations due to its inconsistent and enabling influence with respect to fascism, Dimitrov, on the contrary, calls for an even greater pressure to be exerted by the United Front movements to force the League of Nations to perform the tasks that are in its power to extend in view of hampering fascist development, primary among them being the application of strict sanctions to the fascist countries. Quote, "What interest has the proletariat in playing into the hands of the warmongers, all of whom are at present against the League of Nations? The League of Nations has been deserted by the chief instigators of war, Germany and Japan. The League of Nations includes the Soviet Union, which throws all its international weight into the scales on the side of peace and collective security." Unquote. In the end, the successful mobilization of as vast a people's front as possible comes down to the strength of the United Front of the proletariat, the workers of the world whose combined power alone is capable of leading such an anti-fascist offensive. Quote, "The struggle for peace is a struggle against fascism, a struggle against capitalism, a struggle for the victory of socialism throughout the world." Unquote. By the conclusion of the Seventh Congress, Dimitrov believes that the stage is set for the greatest ever mobilization of working people against capitalism. The active role of the Soviet Union in uniting the workers the world over is here at its zenith. The Soviet Union stands as the first great example, the actuality of socialism as the effective overthrow of the ruling national class structure and its replacement with a new arrangement of forces in pursuit of the full liberation of humanity from the capitalist mode of production. There is a great confidence in these pages in the overwhelming power of the great majority striving for socialism and freedom who will join to counteract the corrosive advances of fascism. Of course, we know that such a routing out of the fascist threat does not come to pass in the way that Dimitrov believes it will, though indeed it will be the Soviet Union that will be responsible for the great wartime defeat of fascism, which had managed to rise to the scale of world domination. Yet the ideas of the Seventh Congress still remain valid, and the fact that history did not unfold quite as Dimitrov viewed it would does not invalidate these essential contributions to thinking through the practical tasks of unity and the effective fight back against fascism and war. The thinking of Dimitrov revolves around the essential questions that never cease to be relevant insofar as we continue to live in the world that capitalism has created. They are those that require a deep investment in the dialectic between idea and practice, the specificity of history, the struggle for unity, the experimental working out of tactics, and the full investment in the life of the people, of all working people, as the fundamental basis for verification and embodiment of theory. In the fight against fascism, the principles that shape the forms of struggle engaged in by Marx and Lenin are given an historical specificity and direction that accounts for the specific challenges and dynamics of fascism and its preparatory and advanced stages. It is thus a matter of protecting the advancements achieved by workers under bourgeois dictatorships from being eroded under fascist ones. This preservation of bourgeois democracy is, however, not a retreat from the guiding aims of scientific socialism, but rather the actual, historically specific application of it, insofar as socialism is indissolubly linked to democratic advances, and thus will always be that which seeks to preserve at all costs whatever democratic advances have been won by organized workers. For Dimitrov and the Communist International in this period, it is clearly not at all a matter of indifference whether the working class is fighting a bourgeois dictatorship or fascist dictatorship. The immediate aims are thus set down in extreme clarity. Quote, in countries of bourgeois democracy, we want to block the way of reaction and the offensive of capital and fascism, prevent the abolition of bourgeois democratic liberties, forestall fascism's terrorist vengeance upon the proletariat and the revolutionary section of the peasantry and intellectuals, and save the young generation from physical and spiritual degeneracy, unquote. Does the failure to stem the tide of fascism prove the failure of this approach? Certainly not. For the ascendancy of fascism had almost everything to do with the degeneration of capitalism itself, a tendency of corrosion and crisis that overtook the bourgeois democracies who gave themselves up to the totally illiberal anti-democratic forces of capitalism and decay. If there was any failure on the part of the communists themselves, it would be that of not more fully putting the ideas Dimitrov outlines here into practice. For Dimitrov is setting out the possibility and necessity of creating as wide a unity as possible in opposition to that which tears people apart, that which destroys lives. Imperialism and war are those things that must be avoided, that need to be repelled with as great a united force as possible. The widest possible people's front against the decay of capitalism, expressed as imperialism and war, instigated by the most reactionary forms of anti-democratic control, is that which alone can ensure we do not slide back but move ever forward. The preservation of formal bourgeois democratic rights is thus pursued not for the sake of the validity of those rights in themselves, but for the relative advancement that they represent, paid for in workers' labor and blood, which mark them as transitional moments to an even fuller democratic investment of the people, an amplification of democratic freedoms that pervades and unifies the social, political, and economic realities within which workers are imbricated. The tactical shifts in the Communist international policy regarding the United People's Front movement against fascism represents the living, fluid nature of scientific socialism to adapt itself to changing historical events and challenges. The ideas of Communist International at this time drive home the fundamental need to not cling to formula or slogans that betray a belief in the invariable and universally fixed nature of socialist construction and resistance but rather to plunge into the historically specific contextual makeup of the individual countries in which a mass movement of the workers is trying to be developed. Unity is not gained by abstract, seemingly universal appeals and cajoling, but through the active embodiment of ideas in specific contexts and the elaboration of those ideas through struggle. This is the unity we are still trying to build. And so, while the relations of forces in this period are of course distinct from those we are within right now, we affirm that the driving ideas of the Communist International are as relevant today as they were then. Though the fascist threat is not as developed as it was in the 1930s, one need only look around a little bit to see how the quantitative buildup of fascist tendencies within the bourgeois liberal democracies today are accelerating the qualitative tipping points of transition into fascist dictatorships threatening to arrive very soon. One need not do too much research to discover the general tendency of imperialism today becoming more and more desperate, the continual fevered pursuit of super profits and consolidation of wealth and power within the hands of a few at the top of the socio-economic order becoming ever more accentuated, the resultant widespread conflict and threat of global war becoming ever greater. We are thus, nearly 100 years later, in much the same position with respect to the extreme contradictions of the moment, with 21st century fascism and war asserting themselves all around us. Add to this the global, unprecedented in human history disasters and catastrophic potential of global warming, and it becomes clear the magnitude of what we are up against. All the more, then, we say, that the lessons of Dimitrov be thoroughly learned and applied as far as possible. For unity is the only way forward, the largest possible binding of all forces of progress, the largest possible coalition of forces in joint struggle is the only way to correct course and avert these greatest of dangers. Sectarianism, dogmatism, goat-alone individualism, and the like are what the United Front opposes in the strongest possible sense. The United Front of Workers and the People's Front against fascism and war, with militant working-class leadership, is the only way forward, for it is the only way that we can not only survive the crises that beset us, but fundamentally transform the conditions of the world to achieve that state of affairs communists throughout history have devoted their lives to one day bringing into being. A human collectivity of peace and freedom, where systematic oppression has been abolished the world over. This is the transcendence of human history such as it has played out until now, the fundamental radicality of the communist idea, radical because it is both necessary and impossible within the current arrangement of forces. Our job is to make the impossible possible and to make the possible actual. This world historical task is not just the affair of communists, but of the great majority of the people, the masses in motion. Dimitrov opens up the radicality of this question and the corresponding immensity of its solution. And this is why we continue to read him today.